And Jeff, let me go to you first. So based on these latest developments here, how does the investigation change into what happened?
Well, I think that picture and that statement from the prosecutor there says it all. Yesterday, we heard from the BEA, and that is the French equivalent of the National Transportation Safety Board. They are the airplane crash investigators. We didn't hear from them today. We're hearing from the prosecutor, and what that suggests is that this is an investigation that has changed. Now there is more of a criminal focus, and there will be more of a closer and examined look at this co-pilot and what his background is. And I just learned from the FAA that he had a private pilot certificate from the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, in this country. That's information that I just got from the FAA. Trying to delve a little deeper into what that means. Did he fly planes here in the U.S.? So we're trying to find out as much information as we can about this co-pilot. We know from officials with Germanwings and Lufthansa that he had joined that company, Lufthansa, Germanwings, in 2013, and he was about 18 months out of flight school at the time of this crash.
So, you know, we keep going over thinking about his mental state, and I'm wondering what sort of background checks or vetting process is there when you are able to fly for a commercial airline or able to fly here in this country?
Well, I think that's what a lot of people who are watching this are wondering, and that's something that we're going to be delving into a little bit more, is the process that these pilots have to go through to get at the controls of these commercial airliners. So there are going to be a lot of questions about that, and we're going to look into it in terms of what is happening in Europe as far as pilot certification is concerned and what happens here in the U.S. There are obviously medical evaluations. That is something that is done. But we're going to take a closer look at these evaluations of these pilots, because I think that's going to be one of the big questions coming out of this, but also the protocols in terms of how to get into these cockpits. That's something that's going to be looked at closely today and in the coming days, because as you know, after 9/11, there was this effort to fortify the cockpit doors. And so on the inside of the cockpit, you have a toggle switch, of course, that can control who enters and who stays out. There's a keypad on the outside and a phone as well. But it is the person in the cockpit who can control who is going in and who is going out. And if there's only one person in the cockpit, as it was in this case, according to the prosecutor, well, then that can be problematic.
All right, Jeff, we'll ask you to stand by. I want to go to Mark Rosenker now and ask about the policy, because we know here in the U.S. there is a requirement to have two people in the cockpit at all times. What about around the world? Is that the case as well, Mark?
Well, there are policies in the United States that do require a no-alone zone, and that's the cockpit, which means when, in fact, a flight deck officer leaves, you must have a second person on board to go inside and thereby help identify the person that is going to try to come back in. And you look through that little peephole, you see that's the individual that's authorized to come back in. You tell the pilot you can unlock, or you can unlock it by the door itself.
I'm curious, is there another way of communicating to anyone else, to other planes outside of the cockpit? If you're a pilot who's locked outside of the cockpit, can you communicate at all?
No, the only thing that you might have is the intercom where you're trying to talk to the cockpit, and obviously in this case, there was no interest in talking to anybody.
Jeff, I want to go back to you about this new information that you're just getting about this person, the co-pilot Andreas Lubitz, getting his private pilot certification in this country. Do you have any more details on when that took place? And I'm also curious, what is that process like in terms of spending time here in this country? What would the requirements for that be?
Well, here's what I just learned. As you were asking me that question, the date of issue of this private pilot certificate was 2012. And this is something that authorizes him, according to the FAA, to fly single-engine general aviation aircraft and gliders. According to the Federal Aviation Administration, they have no way of knowing if he's actually flown either of those, an aircraft or a glider, here in the U.S. But again, we're just trying to gather new information about this co-pilot, because over the last couple of days, we didn't get a lot of information about this co-pilot. We were looking for more information yesterday, but in the initial hours after the crash, Lufthansa and other officials talked about the captain of the plane and his credentials. They said at the time that he had flown for Lufthansa and Germanwings for about 10 years and had about 6,000 hours of flight time in an Airbus A320. But we didn't hear a lot about the co-pilot, and today we're going to try and find out more information. And what we're hearing from the FAA in terms of his contact with officials here in the U.S. is that he had this FAA private pilot certificate, which authorizes him to fly single-engine general aviation aircraft and gliders. There is nothing at this point to suggest that he had flown commercially here in the U.S.
So, Mark, about this private pilot certificate, how does one go about getting this? Is this just a matter of filling out some paperwork and proving that you have the credentials elsewhere? Do you physically have to get into a plane and prove you can fly?
Who are you asking?
Mark Rosenker.
Okay, I'm sorry. Someone was attempting to get into the phone with me. The way you would do this is you would go to a flight school. You would have a flight instructor teach the various technique to flying. You'd go to a ground school. You'd be able to take a test. You actually do a test with a flight instructor, and at that point he signs you off, and at that point you get the FAA certificate to fly a single-engine aircraft.
I'm sorry, Mark, I might have missed it, but so are those schools required to be in the United States then?
If you're getting an FAA license, you're getting it through an FAA authorized instructor.
So he would have had to have been in this country in order to obtain that license, in other words?
Yes, you don't get an FAA license if you're flying from Germany, for example. You'd get something from their German officials.
So based on Jeff's reporting now, we can definitively say that he had spent some time in the United States at some point, and he obtained that certification in 2012. How long a period does that take, I'm curious, the certification, the private pilot certification?
Depends upon how quickly you want to do it. Remember that you've got to have the minimum, I guess it's 40 hours to be able to get this type of certificate. So it might take a few months. What's interesting is that the Airbus has a training school in Miami. So he may have gone to the Airbus training school there and at the same time chosen to get a private license.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, now that this looks like it's a criminal investigation, is the FBI involved at all?
Well, we spoke with sources. Obviously, this is something that they are paying attention to. I can tell you that yesterday, when the information started to develop, it was the New York Times who first reported that one of the cockpits was, one of the pilots was not in the cockpit. Initially, U.S. law enforcement and U.S. intelligence sources were telling us that this was viewed as maybe something mechanical. There was really no focus on the co-pilot. Our sources are telling us that this is something that obviously will change today. There will be a renewed focus on this pilot and his background. We know already that he is 28 years old. He's a German citizen, and he'd been flying for Germanwings since 2013. So we're going to try and learn more information about him.
Mark, you have been on a number of investigations during your time as NTSB chair. I wonder, what are the questions that you most want answered right now?
Well, as we said earlier, or I said this, I guess, a few days ago, what we are looking for and the working theories that we start in the beginning of these investigations rarely are still on the table by the time we determine the probable cause. In this case, it is quite obvious. It is not looking like this was a accident in any type where either the aircraft didn't perform properly or the two pilots together made errors. What it's looking like is this is turning into a criminal investigation. So this is absolutely extraordinary. The news that we got last night, it indicated that a pilot had been locked out of his cockpit and that the first officer was now in charge and attempting to bring this aircraft down is really absolutely mind-boggling, shocking. And clearly, without having a second person on the flight deck, there was nothing that could be done to prevent what ultimately happened, to crash into the mountains.
Mark, what kind of psychological vetting, if you will, or questioning does one have to go through to become a pilot for a major carrier? And once you get the job, do you have to check in about your mental state periodically?
Well, these are not the most rigorous of mental examinations that go into hiring. They go through a series of questions, and they're mostly looking at your physical condition. You have to go through what they call a flight physical, and you've got to basically be in good physical condition in order to be able to get a job with the airlines. But the questions that are asked obviously are basically your background and your financial and your emotional conditions and those kinds of things. And they give you a battery of psychological tests, but again, they're not as rigorous as we might find, say, for other professions.
Mark, we know that these measures to secure cockpits were put into place after 9/11. Do we think perhaps based on what's happened here, there might be a reconsideration of maybe changing once more how those cockpits are secured?
Certainly that's going to be looked at, I am confident, but if you have two people on the flight deck, it is a much more difficult situation to do what we've just seen in this terrible tragedy. It would seem to me the first thing they need to do is to guarantee that there are always two people on the flight deck.
All right. Well, Jeff Pegues, I know you're standing by. Thank you so much for joining us. And Mark Rosenker as well. Thank you, gentlemen.